billionaire in handcuffs over a $11 bottle of olive oil. What happened next turned a moment of humiliation into a nationwide movement for justice. Rachel Matthews had always been a woman of quiet influence. A billionaire tech entrepreneur, her wealth was vast, but her presence remained remarkably understated. She built her empire not on the pursuit of fame, but by revolutionizing industries and funding causes close to her heart. For Rachel, success was never about accumulation, but impact. Yet, on a seemingly ordinary Saturday, her decision to go out shopping alone would set off a chain of events that would shatter the carefully curated life she had built. On that day, Rachel simply wanted a slice of normalcy. Dressed in a modest grey pantsuit, she blended in seamlessly among the crowds at a local supermarket. No bodyguards, no publicist, just Rachel, quietly moving through the aisles. She grabbed items from the shelves, not thinking about her wealth or status, just a woman buying groceries for her family. It was a break from the life she often hid behind, and in that mundane moment, Rachel found a fleeting sense of peace. But as she reached the checkout aisle with a cart full of groceries, a sudden, jarring alarm broke the calm. Heads turned. The room fell silent. Rachel froze. Had she accidentally triggered the alarm with an item she hadn't scanned? She stood still, trying to make sense of the situation as a store employee briskly approached her. His face was tight, and his body language told her this wouldn't be just a simple misunderstanding. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside," the employee said, his voice sharp and authoritative. Rachel raised an eyebrow, bewildered. The employee pointed to a bottle of olive oil peeking out from the edge of her cart. "You didn't scan that item," he accused loudly, causing murmurs to spread through the crowd. Rachel, still calm, explained she hadn't even reached the checkout yet, but her words fell on deaf ears. The situation escalated quickly. More store staff appeared, and before Rachel could process what was happening, they were calling the police. The tension in the air was palpable, and Rachel couldn't help but feel the weight of everyone's gaze. They had already made up their minds about her, assuming entitlement simply because she appeared wealthy. As Rachel stood there, the tension around her thickened. The murmurs of judgment and suspicion floated through the air, growing louder with each passing second. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers, some full of curiosity, others tinged with disdain. Their gaze lingered, each whisper adding weight to the already uncomfortable situation. The employee's sharp accusation hung in the air, yet she remained composed, refusing to let their assumptions dictate her response. This wasn't about the olive oil. It wasn't about a simple checkout mistake. It was about something much deeper. Rachel glanced at the bottle of olive oil, still sitting innocently in her cart. She could almost hear the disapproving mutterings that swirled around her. "She's probably used to getting away with things like this," one of the onlookers whispered. Rachel's heart sank slightly, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't here to prove her innocence to the crowd. She was simply here to pay for her groceries. But the scrutiny was inescapable. As the police arrived, 2 officers stepped into the store, their presence more commanding than comforting. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, immediately approached Rachel, demanding she step outside. There was no attempt to understand, no concern for the reality of the situation. "Ma'am, we've received a report of shoplifting," the officer said, his words blunt and dismissive. "Please step outside with us." The officer's tone made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. This was an assumption, and they had already made their decision. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she followed the officers toward the door, but her head remained held high. Her mind was spinning, the irony of the situation gnawing at her. She, a woman who had spent years building a legacy of philanthropy, was now being treated as if she were guilty of a crime she hadn't committed. The officer's actions felt like an insult, not just to her, but to everyone who had ever been unfairly targeted based on appearances alone. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just about the humiliation she felt in that moment. It was about the systemic biases that were playing out in real time, and it was time to hold those responsible accountable. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that her response would send ripples beyond this store, beyond this incident. This was just the beginning. As Rachel was led outside, the crowd of onlookers grew larger. their whispers now accompanied by the flashing lights of the patrol car. The chill of the evening air did nothing to quell the heat of the situation, the rising tension that gripped her. She could hear snippets of conversation from those watching, some sympathetic, others judgmental. "She's probably used to this," one voice murmured, while another added, "She's just acting calm because she thinks she's above it all." The stares were unrelenting, the scrutiny stinging as she walked toward the waiting patrol car. Rachel's thoughts raced, but she refused to allow the shame they tried to impose on her to take hold. This wasn't the first time she had been unfairly judged. This wasn't the first time someone had assumed things about her because of how she looked. She had spent years fighting for equality, for justice, and for a world where assumptions didn't dictate the fate of a person. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of a parking lot, unjustly accused and detained. The cruelty of it all was suffocating, but she kept her composure, knowing that the fight wasn't just for her. The officers, their expressions hard and dismissive, led her to the back of the patrol car. The younger officer, though still following protocol, seemed hesitant. His eyes flickered between her and the manager, still holding tight to the false narrative they had created. It wasn't lost on Rachel that his unease seemed rooted in the awareness of how wrong this entire scenario was. But the older officer was determined, intent on following through with the detainment, regardless of the obvious misunderstanding. Once inside the car, Rachel's thoughts turned inward. As she sat there, her hands still cuffed in front of her, she thought about the countless people who had faced this same mistreatment, the injustice that seeped into every corner of society. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was a reflection of the systemic bias that permeated everyday life. The feeling of helplessness many must have experienced in similar situations gnawed at her. It wasn't just the violation of her rights. It was the reality that so many never had the opportunity to fight back, to make their voices heard. She couldn't let it go unchallenged. She knew, even in the depths of this absurd situation, that this moment had the potential to spark a movement for change. No, it wasn't about a bottle of olive oil. It was about the bigger picture, the unfair treatment that had been normalized, the abuses of power that had gone unchecked for too long. And she wasn't going to stand by and let it slide. This fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The ride to the station was eerily quiet. The only sounds that filled the car were the low hum of the engine and the crackle of the police radio. Rachel, still sitting handcuffed in the back seat, stared out the window, trying to steady her thoughts. The world outside seemed unaffected by the storm inside the car. The quiet hum of the city moving on, while her life, her reputation, was being dragged through the mud by a misunderstanding so painfully absurd. She thought back to her years of hard work, the countless hours spent developing groundbreaking tech, improving healthcare, creating jobs, fighting for equality. And now, here she was, a billionaire tech entrepreneur, handcuffed in the back of a police car over an $11 bottle of olive oil. The sheer irony was almost too much to bear. But Rachel had been through adversity before. Her journey hadn't been easy. She had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Oakland, where the odds were always stacked against her. She had learned early on that the world wasn't fair, but that didn't mean she had to play by its rules. She had fought her way up, not for the money, but for the chance to make a difference. This wasn't the first time she had faced discrimination or judgment, but this moment, this violation, felt different. It wasn't just a challenge to her. It was a challenge to the very values she had spent her entire life cultivating. As the car slowed and pulled into the station parking lot, Rachel clenched her fists. This wasn't just about her anymore. She wasn't going to let this humiliation be the end of the story. She was going to make sure it sparked something bigger. The door opened, and the officers escorted her inside, their steps deliberate as they led her into a cold, sterile room. Rachel remained silent, but her resolve was clear. She wasn't going to leave this situation as just a victim. She was going to turn it into a movement that would force people to confront their biases and the way they treated others based on assumptions. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about changing the narrative, about fighting back against the systems that allowed injustice to thrive unchecked. As the door closed behind her, Rachel knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger than herself. The minutes stretched on in the sterile room. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the cold reality of the situation. Rachel Matthews sat still, her hands resting in her lap, her posture composed despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. She had been through many battles in her life, but this felt different. It wasn't just the injustice of the situation, but the very fact that she was being treated like a criminal when all she had done was attempt to buy something as trivial as a bottle of olive oil. Rachel Matthews ran through her options in her mind. She could fight back, demand that the police release her immediately, and make this situation public. But deep down, Rachel knew that the fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had ever been wrongly accused, misjudged or mistreated, because of assumptions and stereotypes. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much deeper, something ingrained in the system that needed to be addressed. The door to the small room opened and the officers returned. Their expressions were stiff, almost apologetic, but Rachel wasn't fooled. She had been here long enough to know that the true test of a person's character came when they were faced with consequences. The older officer, the one who had seemed so confident in his actions, held a stack of papers in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was filled with an uncomfortable formality. "Ma'am," he began, "we've reviewed the footage from the store. It seems there was indeed a mistake. You didn't attempt to steal anything. We apologize for the misunderstanding." Rachel took a slow, steady breath, the weight of his words settling heavily in her chest. A mistake? A misunderstanding? After everything she had endured, they were trying to frame it like that. She held back a bitter laugh. They had dragged her through the mud, handcuffed her, and humiliated her in front of a crowd, and now they were calling it a mistake? The injustice of it all, the casual disregard for her dignity. It was infuriating. "You apologize for the misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice calm but biting. "That's it?" She stood up, her hand still cuffed in front of her. "What about the harm that's been done? What about the damage to my reputation, the violation of my rights?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but the older officer didn't meet her eyes. Rachel could see the cracks in their armor now, the way they avoided her gaze, unwilling to face the truth of their actions. They had underestimated her, assumed she would buckle under the weight of the situation, and now they were regretting it. "I'm free to go," she said, her tone cold. "But don't think this is over." She took a deep breath and met their eyes. "Not for me, and not for anyone else who's been wronged like this." As she stepped out of the room and back into the station's hallway, Rachel knew her fight was just beginning. The real work had just started, and she was ready. Rachel stepped out of the police station, the cool night air hitting her face as the door closed behind her. The moment she had been dreading was finally over, but the battle was far from won. She could still feel the sting of the handcuffs on her wrists, the heat of the stares from onlookers, and the weight of the unjust treatment that had been thrust upon her. She had been dragged through the mud, humiliated in front of strangers, and yet she knew that she couldn't let this slip into the past without confronting it head-on. Her phone buzzed incessantly as messages and notifications flooded in, but Rachel didn't need to look. She had already known what was happening. The video of her arrest had gone viral, shared by thousands of people who had witnessed the injustice unfold. Some were outraged, others supportive, and many more simply stunned by the absurdity of it all. The hashtags had started trending: "Dare Rachel profiling," "Bias in action." Rachel knew this was no longer about her. This was about the countless others who had been wronged, humiliated and oppressed by systemic biases. The more she thought about it, the more her resolve solidified. She had spent her career using technology and innovation to make a difference, but this was a different kind of fight, a fight for dignity, for fairness, and for the people who never had the platform or the resources to fight back. She reached for her phone and dialed Elliot's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm but filled with concern. "Rachel, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, the weariness in her voice betraying her. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been unfairly targeted, every person who's been judged without a chance to explain themselves. We have to do something about it." Elliot paused, taking in her words. "I know, and we will. What's your plan?" Rachel took a deep breath, standing tall in the parking lot, a quiet determination settling in her chest. We need to make sure this is bigger than one incident. It's time to launch something meaningful. I want to start a movement, Elliot. A movement for justice, education, and accountability. The seed was planted. The fight would be long and the path uncertain, but Rachel had never backed down from a challenge before. Now, more than ever, she understood the power of her voice, and she wasn't going to let this moment slip away. She was going to turn this humiliation into a catalyst for change. And the journey had only just begun. As Rachel's resolve solidified, the next few weeks were a blur of planning, meetings, and sleepless nights. She knew she had the attention of the public, but she needed more than just outrage. She needed to channel the collective anger into something lasting. A call to action, not only for accountability, but for systemic change. Her initiative, Project Equity, began to take shape. The idea was simple: tackle the roots of racial profiling, discrimination, and bias that often went unchecked in everyday life. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the clarity of purpose fueled her every move. It wasn't just about holding the officer accountable, it was about preventing future injustices from happening to anyone else. Rachel reached out to her network of influencers, social justice leaders, and even fellow entrepreneurs who understood the importance of using their platforms for good. She also found unexpected allies, people who had been silent until they saw her standing tall against the injustice. They were the ones who would stand beside her, amplifying her message. Together they worked to craft a comprehensive training program for public-facing employees, from retail workers to law enforcement officers. The focus was on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and fostering empathy, all while encouraging organizations to be transparent about their hiring practices and internal policies. Rachel knew that change couldn't happen with a single conversation or a singular effort. It would take time, consistency, and the willingness of society to confront its uncomfortable truths. In parallel, Rachel's legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the legal ramifications of her case were handled swiftly. The supermarket chain had issued a vague apology, but it wasn't enough. She demanded transparency, requesting that they hold a town hall to address how their training would evolve and how they planned to ensure incidents like hers never happened again. Every day brought more challenges. The media coverage intensified, and Rachel found herself at the center of the storm. But the hate, the judgment, the accusations, they only made her more determined. The shift in public perception had already begun. People were talking, debating, and engaging in discussions that had been absent for far too long. In the end, Rachel knew the real power lay not in the headlines or the protests, but in the quiet transformations that would begin to take place within communities. It wasn't just about a lawsuit or making noise. It was about reshaping the narrative. It was about making sure that no one, no matter their background or their appearance, would ever have to face unjust assumptions again. The movement had only just begun, and Rachel was at the forefront, unshaken and ready to take on whatever came next. As the momentum of Project Equity continued to build, Rachel Matthews's focus turned to ensuring that the conversations sparked by her story would not fizzle out. She knew that the real test of any movement was whether it could inspire long-term change, not just in policy, but in the hearts and minds of individuals. The first step was to make sure that the training programs for public-facing employees were actually implemented. Rachel knew that organizations would pay lip service to change, but true transformation would come when employees understood why their actions mattered on a personal level. She wanted them to realize that bias wasn't just something that existed in isolated pockets of society. It was ingrained in the very systems they participated in. Project Equity's curriculum aimed to do more than just raise awareness. It aimed to shift perspectives, asking people to confront uncomfortable truths and actively choose to do better. Through partnerships with community leaders, civil rights organizations, and educators, Rachel expanded the scope of Project Equity to reach schools and workplaces. She encouraged young people to speak out, reminding them that their voices had power. The conversations about systemic bias were no longer just for activists or the marginalized. Everyone had a stake in creating a society built on respect and fairness. Meanwhile, Rachel took the time to personally meet with the officers and employees involved in her incident. Her goal wasn't to create enemies, but to foster understanding. She sat down with the younger officer who had hesitated when they were arresting her, the one who had seemed unsure about the necessity of the situation. She understood that real change couldn't come from a place of anger, it had to come from empathy. The supermarket, which had once been at the center of the scandal, became an example of how an organization could evolve. They implemented Rachel's recommendations for anti-bias training, and she helped them launch a customer service initiative aimed at fostering inclusivity and transparency. Rachel made sure their progress was visible, not because she sought credit, but because it was important that others saw the potential for growth. Months passed, and the ripples of change Rachel set in motion grew wider. She knew the fight wasn't over, it would never be over. But the seeds had been planted, and as she stood before a crowd at a community event one evening, she could see the change in their eyes. People were waking up, people were standing up, people were changing. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the moment settle in. "This," she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve, "is how we make justice the rule, not the exception." The crowd erupted in applause, but Rachel knew the applause wasn't for her. It was for the countless others who had stood up with her, for the people who were ready to demand change. The journey was far from over, but Rachel Matthews had done more than fight for herself. She had started a movement that would outlive her, one that would continue to fight for justice, dignity, and respect for all. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all. The story of Rachel Matthews highlights a powerful lesson about the impact of bias and the importance of standing up for justice, no matter your background or status. In today's society, we often witness assumptions being made based on appearance, wealth, or race, and these assumptions can lead to harmful and unjust treatment. Rachel's experience reminds us that no one is immune to bias, and even those with privilege can face unfair treatment. It's crucial to acknowledge the systemic biases that exist in our communities, workplaces, and institutions, and actively work to address them. If you find yourself in a position of power or influence, consider using that platform to promote fairness and equality. Start by educating yourself and those around you about the unconscious biases we all carry and how they affect our interactions. Whether it's in a workplace setting, while shopping, or in everyday encounters, challenge assumptions and strive to treat everyone with dignity and respect. For those who experience unfair treatment, like Rachel, remember that you are not alone. Speak up when something isn't right, document the situation, and seek support. Together, we can create a society where injustice is not tolerated and where every individual's voice matters. Take action, whether by supporting organizations fighting for racial equality, pushing for policy changes, or simply being more conscious in your own daily interactions. The choice to make a difference lies within all of us.